Hello and welcome, Dr. Muller. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mavelia, for this kind invitation and for the opportunity you give me to present myself and my research. So I'm Dr. Jil Muller, at the moment Deputy Director of the Center for the History of Human Philosophers and Scientists and postdoctoral researcher at the University of Paderborn here in Germany. I did my research studies and my whole university studies, so bachelor, master, and PhD, at the University of Strasbourg in France. And I completed my doctoral thesis in 2019 in the early modern period. I worked on Michel de Montaigne and René Descartes and her receptions of the original sin. I analyzed how they received this idea of original sin during and after the secularization process, and how they evolved and explained methods to their readers to overcome or avoid faults, errors, and sins. In 2021, I came here to Paderborn. I worked first in a DFG-founded project on Émilie du Châtelet and the Paris manuscripts. The Paris manuscript is the Institution de Physique, which we digitized and then transcribed and put online for a larger public. And in 2022, I became assistant professor under Professor Hangruber in the chair of practical philosophy and the deputy of the Center for the History of Women Philosophers and Scientists.
So then let's stay a moment on this wonderful Center for the History of Women Philosophers and Scientists with the direction of Professor Ruth Hangruber. What is that about?
So the Center for the History of Women Philosophers and Scientists was founded in 2016 by Professor Hangruber already. So next year in 2026, we have to celebrate 10 years of existence. Yeah, and the center's objective is mostly to shed light on the forgotten writers, female philosophers, female scientists. And in this context, we are digitizing manuscripts and putting them online to give access to a larger public. But we are also collecting data and promoting the work of these female philosophers by organizing conferences and scientific events. It is a very, I would say, exciting work, because when we are discovering new philosophers or new concept, we can see how the different elements of history and of history of philosophy are connected together. And so perhaps when we are reading a woman philosophers, we better understand the male philosopher and so on. So it's very thrilling, because we are always going along with what we have already, the traditional, I would say, traditional history of philosophy, but at the same amount, we are putting something more in it, in offering new perspectives in philosophy by introducing women philosophers into the traditional canon. The center's renommee, probably you know, is very huge. We have every year a lot of fellows visiting us from around the world. Even now in summer, there are some fellows coming and visiting us, and our community, our international network, is growing every year a lot. We had so many people, international researcher, but also institutes who want to collaborate with us. And we are very proud, because we are followed from all over the world on our social media channels and on our huge database of of our YouTube channel. There was already a lot of work done, but our journey into the history of women philosophers is still long, I will say.
Amazing. But you were born in Luxembourg, studied in France, as you said, work in Germany, and were awarded a prize in Italy. You are a true European.
Yes, that is very true. And I speak a lot of languages. I fluently speak English, Luxembourgish, German, French, Italian, and I read also a little bit of Spanish. And I would say, yeah, I'm a really European, because I was born in 1990. So to say, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I think into a decade where Europe and politicians were really onto the aim of unifying Europe. I feel a little bit that we are now in these days missing a little bit this aim, this goal of Europe. But I also think that philosophy could offer a good alternative to this missing objective of the politicians, because when philosophy is occupied with politics and with political issues, they can give alternatives to reorientate Europe towards a real union. It is very important that we understand that Europe can only grow when its citizens understand that they are Europeans. And how can they understand that they are Europeans? They have to feel like I am feeling, speaking a lot of languages, emerging into different cultures. So I'm feeling like a European. But for this, Europeans have to be considered and heard as Europeans.
Yeah, there is also kind of scientific diplomacy of philosophers and scientists, going around at conferences, exchanging ideas. So this is a real diplomacy too.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we are trying, and I, as a European, I am trying to do this, involving always a lot of my colleagues into my own research project, into ideas, into events, so that we can connect better, that we not only growing here in Germany, but that we are profiting from our growth and putting it in other countries. Like we have a lot of fellows from Croatia, from Eastern Europe, but also in Italy or Portugal, but also overseas on the other continent, in America, for example, in Chile, Argentina. And we are doing a lot also to help them build up research centers and becoming more in a union of researchers. Yeah.
But what do you like most about working in philosophy?
So what I love really to do is in philosophy is doing connecting history and philosophy. As I told before, I studied in France, and in France it is common to do, when you're doing philosophy, you are doing history of philosophy. And what does it mean doing history of philosophy? Doing history of philosophy is understanding a concept in his historical context, which means into not only understanding this concept by its own, but also the historical fact, the social and political circumstances, perhaps also connecting a concept to a certain event. And then you can also understand how a concept etymological is developing or is developing linked to a certain historical fact. And so I always a little bit regret that this is not really the method here in Germany, but because I think they are missing something very important, because history is something that tells us even more than only philosophy. Doing philosophy by its own is like doing something abstract, but doing history of philosophy is really concrete. And that is also the focus of the center. The center is history of philosophy, because what we want is to understand that philosophy, but also history of philosophy, is written at the same time by men and women. And it's not only written by men, not only written by a certain type of man, the white men, the white and wise men, but also by women. And we have to understand that history is circular in the sense of events once happened are most probably re-happening again, because we are doing always the same faults. So when we really want to change something, when we want to change future, I think we should first consider that history is written by men and women, and then consider that it is circular, so we can avoid some errors that we did already in the past and going along. This is also why I prefer the early modern period, because the early modern period for me is one of the most fascinating periods of history, because there's happening so much things in the early modern period, from discoveries, inventions, progresses, not only in society, but also in different field of biology, I will say, medicine. There is a lot of inventions and progresses, which we are now always having like something, it's common, it's into our usual facts, but we have to stay aware of the fact that this is coming from history, and we should shed new light on it to be really aware of what we have today, and that it is not so naturally that we have it today.
But as you mentioned, one of your research area is French women philosophers and scientists in the early modern period. Can you tell us something about them?
Yeah, I
Little
was
bit.
coming along to women philosophers when I studied for my PhD thesis. There I read Descartes, and I also do correspondence with Descartes. And I discovered Elizabeth of Bohemia. And when I looked at her, I was not sure if I could count her into philosophers, because there is no written work of Elizabeth of Bohemia apart her letters. We have no more sources about her. And so I was not really sure if she could be counted into what we call philosophers, this concept, which is even to be redefined, I will say, when we are speaking about women philosophers, but this is another question. And in 2018, I came here to Paderborn because there was a big conference organized on Elizabeth of Bohemia. And then I saw here that the researchers here were all interested in Elizabeth and counted her as a philosopher. They were aware that there was no sources in sense of written work, but that we can find her ideas in the letters, and that one has only to consider these letters. And then they started also this big project of translating her correspondence, because it is only available until there in French. So we needed a translation in English for communication and so on. And then I went home and I was, okay, when there is Elizabeth as a philosopher, then there should be other philosophers, female philosophers around Descartes in his surroundings. I was searching by my own to find these women philosophers, but alone I was not so very satisfied about the results I found, because I was like, okay, perhaps Marie de Gournay, perhaps a little bit Mary Cavendish, but then I came along only by Mary Cavendish with her medical textbook, and I was like, is this considered philosophy or not? But then everything changed when I got the position in 2021 here at the center, because not only I discovered the Émilie de Châtelet as a philosopher and with a real material, I will say, because we have the sources, we have the Paris manuscript, the Institution de Physique, but we have also the St. Petersburg manuscript with a whole bunch of more moral texts. And I was like, okay, then when there is these philosophers with sources, then probably there are much more. And so I saw here that they consider Marie de Gournay, which I always saw only as la fille d'alliance de Michel de Montaigne, as a real philosopher. I discovered her text. Then the text is of Sophie Germain, a mathematician and moral philosopher, and also Gabrielle Suchon. And I was like, then we can go along with what I prefer do, searching for moral behavior, moral theories into these female philosophers. And I started investigating in this direction. And I discovered that these female philosophers a lot did, I would say, more or less always the same, but one can understand why. They criticize the society and the patriarchal structure system, the injustice in patriarchal system, and they wanted really to change society because they were aware of the moral misbehavior, of the deviation of moral values when it is in regard to women. And I think this shows again that the early modern period after the Enlightenment is really oriented towards open-mindedness or towards changing society into something more, and one has to focus on these women philosophers.
Yeah, but you are also very interested in medical and anatomical theories in the early modern period. How are bodily dysfunctions and moral behavior connected?
Yeah, I'm really very interested in these medical anatomical theories that started already in my PhD thesis, because when I was investigating into Michel de Montaigne and Descartes' concept original sin, I saw that they ligated this very often to illnesses and bodily dysfunctions. And so I had an old section on my PhD dissertation treating this kind of vapors that are present on the body, to see how they considered these original sin, which could make a weight into the body, because one feels regrets, but regrets is something that is obscuring the soul and so on. And then I discovered that these ideas are very well linked to humanism. Humanism had as a main objective to perfect the mind. human being has to be perfect, and this to strengthen the mind and to strengthen the soul, exercise the soul, giving the right values to the soul. And this is very curious because after the secularization process, the human being was no longer enclosed into, I would say, this fatalism of original sin, and so was no more legated to the guidance of the church. And so there was a more numerous humanist moralists or philosophers who felt the obligation to offer, I would say, like a new morality to society, because society was without guidance. And they offer then the idea that when you are strengthening the mind, you can also behave morally good. So you have to exercise the mind, be intellectual, search for intellectual, for strengthening the intellectual reason, and then you can have and understand the right values and behave morally good. However, this is something very interesting because it's so central to the correspondence of Elizabeth of Bohemia and Descartes. And a very crucial question of Elizabeth is going to Descartes saying, and Descartes is one of the big philosophers saying that the mind is the most important thing we have as human being. Elizabeth is asking Descartes how it could be that when there are bodily dysfunctions, how can we then say that man is always clear in his decisions? I will explain a little bit better. She is saying that there are illnesses concerning the body, which are so important that they are sending like vapors, she says, the vapors to the mind. And these vapors are so strong that the mind is no longer capable of taking the right decision. It's like it has it is like no more functioning very well because these vapors are there and they are obscuring the mind's functioning. And in this case, says Elizabeth, all the exercise we did for the mind, all the exercise we did for the soul is like worthless because the body has taken the power as is even more important. And then what can we do? Then the mind cannot do its right function. It cannot take decisions. It cannot make us behave in the right manner. And I think that is really what is important in these early modern women philosophers, because they really try to have an answer to this question, to the question how body dysfunctions and moral behavior can be connected or are connected. And we experience every day that they are connected. We know very well that depending on our bodily state, we are reacting differently in society or against or towards other men and human beings. And I think really that in early modern period, this is one of the questions that are taken up by female philosophy, because they are aware of this problem, because they are aware of society, and they are looking at society and how this it is really happening into society. So I say always to my students, I say the male philosophers has a theory, but the female philosophers have to practice, because they are looking at society and how man is behaving in society, and they are saying that moral behavior is not only about reasoning just and adapted, but it's also about how people are feeling, bodily feeling into society.
Oh, wonderful. But you're working on this also when you organize conferences and events. So in 2023, you organized the conference Women and Their Bodies. And next week, your lecture series, Women's Ideas in the History of Medicine, starts. Tell us about it, and tell us also what was your inspiration for that.
Yeah, thanks for letting me speak a little bit about this conference. It was a huge success, this Women and Their Body conference. This was a huge success also afterwards on YouTube. And now I can also say that the proceedings of this conference are already under publication by De Gournay. So the book will probably come out this year. I hope so. But I organized this conference after that. I have organized a lecture with my students. And this was a reaction from my side on what has happened in 2022, because in 2022 in Afghanistan, the Taliban decided that young girls should no longer go to school. And I was like, okay, this is the beginning of a whole bunch of things that will happen in this country, which will make it worse for women and girls. And I was not wrong, I will say. It happened exactly what, this was only the first step, I will say, in this country to abolish some rights for women and girls. And in the same year, in the US, they restarted discussing about the right to abortion because the Supreme Court abolished the sentence of 1973, which established that abortion was a constitutional right. And so I was thinking, okay, this is an issue I should discuss with my students, because my students, a lot are female students in philosophy at bachelor level, and they should have an opinion on this. But it's also for me a kind of training for my male students, because I will say, when they are reflecting on the body and the rights of a woman over her own body, then they can have a more open-minded towards what is happening also politically in their surroundings. And so for me, it is important that philosophy is not closing its eyes when it is coming to political issues. I'm not saying we have to do revolution all the time, but I think in philosophy we should take up these issues and discuss them, because philosophy can offer new perspectives, new alternatives, compromises, new directions, and offer another way to deal with this situation. We have not to accept them because they are happening, but we have to react in this sense that we are wanting to change something. And so the New Voices talk series, which is starting next Wednesday, then on 19th, at 4 at the evening via Zoom, originates only partly of this conference. It is sure that there is some connection, but I started this New Voices talk series, which is, I want only to inform, the second in this series of women's ideas in the history of medicine, because last year we had the one about food, plants, and remedies. Very interesting also, because seeing how one...
Sorry.
Yeah, that's no problem. Okay. Seeing how one can treat different diseases by different plants, foods. This is a very interesting field also. But this idea of organizing this New Voices talk series came from the one hand, came from the fact that I was or I am interested in medical and anatomical theories. And when I searched for the ideas of women in this field, I was like, oh, there are no women. No, is medicine only a male field? And no, probably not. We have to search for it. And then I have to invite someone who is helping me. I cannot do everything by my own. So helping me, they are also creating a bigger network in the history of medicine. And so we connected some people already via the Women and Their Body conference, but also via these women's ideas in the history of medicine. And this is a growing network also. I'm now in contact with a lot of people, also people doing their PhD on exactly these subjects, also like reproduction in Uganda during the missionaries' time and so on. So they're very, very interesting subjects we do not know about because it's not so well traced. Because history is a male written history, so we have to go along with this. And on the other hand, I had the wish to cooperate, and that is linked to what I said before. I'm feeling like a European. I wanted to strengthen not only our center, but also the center in Pisa under Fabrizio Bigotti and his center for the study of medicine and the body in the Renaissance. And I said, okay, let's do something together, which makes us more powerful, but also which opens something new, which has not been done yet. And then there came this idea along to do something on women in the history of medicine. And so this year we are speaking about fertility, reproduction, and maternity, and I'm very happy that it starts next week.
Wonderful. And can you spoil something about who Aspasia was?
Yeah, unfortunately, Aspasia, we have not so much sources about Aspasia. We know that she was a Greek rhetorician and that thanks to her husband, she was integrated into the intellectual happening, I will say, of her time. And we know that that one of these people she met was young Socrates. And we know also that Socrates afterwards said that he was a disciple, a pupil of Aspasia. But yeah, we have few sources of her, we have no written work, and as many commentators used to say, we have a lot of hypotheses about her life. So someone is saying that she was very influential in the political circles of her time. Others are calling them her a prostitute. So we have a very large spectrum of how one can speak about Aspasia. But that is why I'm so happy that next week Irene Kala will speak about Aspasia and other women in the late antiquity, and also to learn more about what are the possible medical knowledge. And I say possible because there is no real sources. We have to take out these ideas from other texts. And there one does never know to which percent it is right or wrong, because it's sources written by someone else, mostly by men. Are they saying everything? Are they hiding something? Yeah. But it will be very interesting next week, I think. And perhaps if I can, I will add some hypotheses about Aspasia. Because when we think about Socrates, and he said that Diotima taught him the concept of love and about the generation of wisdom. And perhaps Aspasia, when he said that he is a student of her, or was a student of her, then probably Aspasia taught him about reproduction and about how wisdom can grow or being fertile.
Ah, fascinating. And what can a sonnet tell us about reproduction? This would be one of the next lecture.
Yeah, exactly. We will go along with different historical moment into the New Voices series, and so we will have Aspasia, but we will also go until Oliver Sabuco, Renaissance philosopher, and so on. So it will really we will concentrate on historical context and on the concept into the historical context. But I think at the end that these concepts are very actual, and that learning something from history can taught us something about our understanding now of this concept of fertility, reproduction, and maternity. Yeah.
Yeah, this will open our eyes more for
Exactly.
something like that. And what about stereotypes about women and health?
Yeah, the stereotype. So I am more afraid always of the gap that is between the medical knowledge or the medical research we are doing now on women's health and men's health. That the female body is different from the male body, we know already since the 17th century. So sometimes I'm afraid of seeing that we are lagging so much behind. Recently, for example, I read a study about drug consumption against pain. And not only that, the studies and tests are always mostly done on the male body, so one has the right proportion of medication for the male body, but not for the female body. Even does one not consider in this indication that female body or that women in general can endure a higher level of pain, of suffering. So this indication of how taking drugs is related to men, but then when women want to feel the same release of pain, then they have to take more drugs because this low level is done for men and not for women. And so this makes, that was the conclusion of this study, makes that women are more often, I would say, pushed towards drug abuse because they are taking this medication on the wrong level, I will say. We are not considered. But for stereotypes, I like this I would say these usual stereotypes what one hears, so like the hysterical uterus of women, or that depression and melancholia is the typical disease of women. I think modern society does a lot to break with these stereotypes. I'm not sure that today medical people, so doctors, will consider an illness in connection with sex. I think they have a catalog of symptoms relating to a certain kind of disease, and they are going with this and not with sex or gender. But what I regret a little bit of Western medicine is more what appeared to me when I had these new voices here from last year, that we are going away from this, I will say, Asian tradition and Asian tradition of healing methods. So, for example, when we have a little pain, a little disease, doctors are always prescribing immediately drugs. So chemical drugs for our health, but nobody is prescribing, I do not know, like a certain diet, plants or herbal remedies, or something, a smooth exercise, physical exercise like yoga or walk in nature. But we know very well that the most of our medical problems, I will say, are related to our lifestyle, that we are too much stressed, that we are not eating well, that we are not taking care of ourselves. So perhaps one could readjust this, and also Western medicine should readjust their prescriptions.
But talking about USA and what's happening there now, against gender-sensitive research that has been already done, and of course against science in general. Can you give us a comment about that?
Yeah, the situation in the US is for me very alarming, because when a president of a democracy is interfering into research, is publishing a list of concepts that research cannot use or cannot divulge, then he is actively interfering in our freedom of speech and opinion. And so he is not only consciously blocking the progress in research in his own country, but he is also forbidding to write about women, about feminism, about gender, transgender, everything we have already fighted for. And now we are going 100 steps back in history, because he's forbidding to go further with research. This is also very alarming, because in this same country, the same president was the one that started again speaking about his law of abortion. So he is interfering into constitutional right, and only for one part of society, namely women. So he is interfering with his ministers and so on into my right as a woman to decide over my own body. That is very, very alarming, because the US are mostly a model for other democratic countries. And the only thing I hope is that nobody is imitating him. But there are countries who want to imitate the US, because they always imitated the US, and I think they will not stop. This will not stop now. As a researcher, I think the only weapon we have as researchers at the moment, and here in Europe, as we are a little bit, I would say, far away, we can only go along with our research, publish even more strongly, making available research on these forbidden concepts. So we should give a voice to women in history, but also to women in our surroundings, as you did by inviting me, for example, because we have to hear these voices, all these voices from history, all these voices from now, and we have to with our research, we have to make people understand that there are alternatives in research, that we are not obliged to follow what is happening in the US, and that forbidding research into gender discussions is not an option.
Absolutely. We should invite these US researchers to Europe as much as possible.
Yeah, that could be an idea, yeah.
And what are you working on at the moment?
As I said before, I am postdoctoral researcher, so I'm writing my habilitation, and my habilitation is oriented in the early modern period, and I'm giving a little scoop of it because I cannot divulge too much. But what I was intended to research was the I call it holistic philosophical anthropology done by early modern women philosophers. What do I intend by this concept? It's a concept because philosophical anthropology is a concept coming from Germany in the 1920s, but I think we can use this concept and go back in history and see that female philosophers in the early modern period, what I said already a little bit before, were very well turned to human being as a unity, human being as a whole. We can, for them, one can understand humans, their reactions and actions only when one considers human being as a whole, as a body and a mind, and not the mind and the body into entities. So I'm working from Oliver Sabuco, a nascent Spanish women philosophers, until Émilie de Châtelet, going via Elizabeth of Bohemia, Margaret Cavendish, Anne Conway, and Mary Estelle, until Émilie de Châtelet, to see how they connect into a more complete image of human beings. So I will also there taking up the idea of suffering and pain, but also of self-knowledge and self-healing powers, of how people react in society. So the concept of I would say a human being in political situation, friendship, or power. How is this influencing the concept of humans, but also the human being in nature, in the cosmos? There's a microcosmos and a macrocosmos. So I think, or I hope something nice will come out of this idea.
I look forward to it. It sounds wonderful. So thank you for all these fascinating insights. 3 more questions before the end. What are your plans for the future? Besides
my personal plans are becoming professor in the near future.
Yeah.
But with the center, we have a lot of things this year. When I can, I will give us a little insight. We have now starting the New Voices talk series on fertility, reproduction, and maternity. But we have also an open day of our center here in Paderborn. We will give a little bit an insight into our research in our team for everyone who is interested. Then we have some fellows coming to visit us in summer. Hopefully we can organize a nice workshop. And we have probably also a summer school in September on Émilie de Châtelet and the documents that were at the Russian library in St. Petersburg, the National Russian Library in St. Petersburg. So we have a lot of things to do and a lot of work, but yeah, it's exactly what I said before. We have a long journey to do, and we are grateful for this.
Wonderful. And your message to those who want to study philosophy today?
Yeah, I think that studying philosophy is very important because it gives you some open-mindedness, some alternatives for thinking this world differently as it is done right now. But I will also say that making philosophy is not making you rich. Philosophy, unfortunately, we have some very problems of being financed and of positions. So with these few positions that are only available, I would say I would not consider or giving the advice to do as I did, but I did it sometimes before, only history of philosophy, because this is now no more searched. So someone who wants to do philosophy should orient it towards AI, robotics, bioethics. This, I will say, more actual related fields in philosophy.
No, but we need everything. We need all.
Yeah, I agree.
And the last question, if you had one wish, what would it be?
Yeah, I wish would that everyone, society, should slow a little bit down. Why is it slowing down? Because one has to focus again on what is really important for us in our lives personally, but also what is important for society. I think this overreacting, exaggerated concurrency for searching for more money, being more perfect, being always the first in everything, has made us losing this focus, and so no more considering human beings as human beings, but only as some marionettes going in the same direction, like machines. Sometimes I say the only wish we had is to have a nice day of calm and slowing down, a nice cup of tea, and good book in philosophy, and then really focusing only on the ideas that are written in these books, so that we can reconcentrate on what is really important.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for your time and your work.
Yeah, thank you too for the interview.